Welcome to Phoenixmasonry Live,
a show about Masonic museum artifacts,
interviews,
Masonic history,
and much more.
I am Frederick L. Milliken, Executive Director of Phoenixmasonry.
And I am Elena Llamas, Director of Public Relations for Phoenixmasonry.
And we are here to
celebrate
our Freemasonry.
Celebrando nuestra francmasonería.
And that's what we do. We celebrate our Freemasonry. And here today we are celebrating with renowned Masonic author Alton Roundtree. Brother Roundtree, welcome to the show.
Well,
thank you for coming.
Thank you all. It's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to it.
Alton G. Roundtree is a writer, publisher, researcher, and editor of the Prince Hall Masonic Digest. He is editor of the Phylaxis magazine. He, along with Paul M. Bessel, is author of the bestseller and internationally acclaimed book, Out of the Shadows, The Emergence of Prince Hall Freemasonry in America Over 225 Years of Endurance. Alton is also the author of the National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry, The Untold Truth, and Conference of Grand Masters, Prince Hall Masons, Conference History, 1887 to 2013. Alton, along with Jeff Menzies, produced the Phylaxis book, The Greatest Prince Hall Mason of the 20th Century. Alton, along with Tehuti Evans, has written a book on the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, History of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge from 1822 to 2016. He is also in the process of updating the history of the Prince Hall Shriners, 1993 through 2017.
Alton has written numerous articles published in local newspapers, among them a Masonic column in the popular Washington Afro-American newspaper chain. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota in Duluth, a master's degree from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and worked on a PhD at American University in Washington, D.C.
Alton has been invited to speak at a number of conventions and meetings, including the Philalethes Society, Phylaxis Society, Blue Friars, the Missouri Lodge of Research, and Academy of Masonic Knowledge of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania.
Alton G. Roundtree, 33rd degree, is a past master of Redemption Lodge number 24 of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C. Alton was the founding Worshipful Master, 2009 to 2012, of the David A. McWilliams Senior Research and Education Lodge of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. Alton is also a 33rd degree Mason, member of Mecca Temple number 10 Shriners, Mount Vernon Chapter number 1 Holy Royal Arch Masons, Henderson Commandery, and Redemption Chapter number 14 of the Order of the Eastern Star. Alton is a member of two distinguished Masonic groups, Society of Blue Friars, 2011, and Masonic Brotherhood of the Blue Forget-Me-Not, 2008. Other affiliations include the Philalethes Society Fellow, Masonic Society Fellow, and Phylaxis Society Fellow. Well, Alton, it is an honor to have you here. We are very, very grateful for your visit. What is on your background? We see some gentlemen there.
In the background there, those are past Grand Masters from Hiram Lodge number 4 here in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the Prince Hall Grand Lodge. And the
excellent. Sorry, yeah, go on.
No, they were used in a Black History display.
Excellent, excellent. So you have a PhD. What is your PhD on?
I don't have a PhD. I worked on.
Oh, I see.
I worked on in sociology.
Oh, excellent. Well, my BA is in sociology. So you published the Masonic Globe.
Yes.
what was your founding work there? Was this is it fair to say that you was this a joint venture with somebody else? Was this your project?
Well, Greg Kearse and I were co-founders of the Masonic Globe. We kind of had this idea. We were sitting in our favorite Ethiopian restaurant, enjoying the food, and we decided that, well, maybe we wanted a magazine. We wanted to do something different, but we didn't want to be bound by any constraints. So the only way to do that would be to have a magazine that didn't come under any Grand Lodge or Masonic entity. So we came up with the Masonic Globe, but we wanted to cover the whole world. That's where the globe comes in at. So we talked about it, we planned it, and then we went out and we executed it. And the one thing to cover the whole globe, of course, we got to have people all over the globe. So we had bureau chiefs and all over the globe, all over the world, Madrid, Paris, London, Romania, Brazil, and actually it worked quite fine. We always had plenty of information from plenty of Masonic authors around the world, and also we had bureau chiefs throughout the United States, so we had no problem with material. And we first published the Globe in 2001. I think it was January 2001, and we went on until 204. I got sick in 204, and it was basically a two-man operation. And then I was trying to write books also, and it was kind of difficult to do both. So the Globe we had to let the Globe go, but we still threatened to start it up again.
You're muted, Fred. So your book, you're muted, Fred. So your book, Out of the Shadows, is your, we thought it was fair to refer to it as your most well-known work. Do you consider this to be your most important work?
I do. Paul Besson and I, we worked on that. We worked on it long and hard, but I consider it to be the best work because it has been far-reaching, and it has sold extremely well since it came out, and it's still going strong because we have some information in there that probably is not collectively in any other place, in that we trace the recognition process for all of the Grand Lodges, how they did it, what they had to do, and how they arrived at the recognition.
So that's the overall theme of the book?
Well, no, we have a lot of other information there. I have a chapter in there on the National Grand Lodge, which actually drove was the driving force for the 982-page book, the National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry Untold Truth. When I came in there with chapter 4 on the National Grand Lodge, I was saying things that like I was saying that National Grand Lodge had never been shut down, and that it had continuity and those things, and that was counter to everything that had been written about the National Grand Lodge in Prince Hall Freemasonry, and also by other writers on the subject.
Well, on a related subject, recently there have been some developments. There has been some controversy regarding the dates and events surrounding the Master Mason ceremonies of Prince Hall and related brothers. Can you tell us what's going on? What is the debate, and what is your position in it?
Well, the debate is, when was Prince Hall and the other 14 brothers raised? And tradition has it, and certainly has been written, that it was March 6, 1775. Recently, last year, John Hairston came out with a book, and he was saying that the actual date is March 6, 1778. And so we've looked at that, and Brother Jeff Mincy, he was able to clean up the page from the minutes enough that we could really see, and the March 6, 1778 date is clear. So my position is, I'm a I'm one who believes in documentation. So
Mm-hmm.
the documentation at this point says March 6, 1778, until someone finds come forth with something earlier.
Did the article I wrote on Joseph Warren offering Prince Hall a warrant in 1775 have any bearing on the subject?
Well, no, because I haven't been able to look at the or have anyone look at those minutes that was referred to in that article. If that should prove to be true, then it would definitely have a bearing, because that would have been something that happened before March 6, 1778.
Right. You know, and we've talked about your first big book and a lot of stuff, but you know, there's other stuff that you did, you know, like the Masonic Digest and also editor of the Phoenixmasonry magazine. And those are two very important things. We need to have you say a few words about those things.
Well,
Yes.
the Masonic Digest, that's the newspaper of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge in the District of Columbia. It was started in 1969, and there's only been 3 editors to it, and I'm the last editor. I came to the Digest in 1992 as the managing editor, and the editor passed, Nick Ayers, and I became the editor in 1997, and I left in 2014, and now in 2017, I'm back on the job again. But I attribute a lot of whatever I've been able to get done probably to being the editor of the Masonic Digest, because we strive to provide information, not just a picture newspaper, but where we actually have researched articles and information in there. So I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot about the different houses in masonry in the process. And it's a pretty big job because it's a 48-page newspaper. That is a lot. It's done quarterly, but that's a lot.
So your experience with the Masonic Globe yielded good results with the Digest.
Yes. Using the same philosophy, at least it works for me. I've found that if you want these things to be successful, it gets down to your writers. You need the good writers, and that makes it.
And of course, you have those in the Phoenixmasonry Society, and that magazine is really top notch. It's not generally circulated publicly, but it's among Prince Hall Masons. It's the premier magazine I think that we go to, and you should be credited for putting out such a great magazine. Tell us a little bit about your editorship of the Phoenixmasonry magazine.
And while you do, Alton, Fred, do you mind fixing your sound? You sound a little funny. Thank you. And go on, Alton.
Okay. Well, the Phoenixmasonry magazine, I came there. John B.
Hello? Oh, no. It looks like I've been left alone. Well, while I'm here, and both of my companions here, it looks like Fred is back. We have lost Alton, and I was just going to talk a little bit about his work, the National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry, The Untold Truth. And while he comes back, Fred, perhaps you and I can talk a little bit about that. Do you want to tell us, Fred, why is this book groundbreaking? In your words, you say that he told everybody that they were wrong in a way. What was known of? Looks like we have Alton back. Alton, can you hear us, Alton? No, he's coming in and out. So do you want to tell us, Fred, why do you think this was a groundbreaking work? The National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry, The Untold Truth.
After the time that Alton did his research, it was considered among Prince Hall Freemasons that the National Compact or National Grand Lodge ceased to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few years later, restarted itself. And because it restarted itself, it lost its transition to being a regularly chartered lodge, the Grand Lodge.
So in other words, this interruption made it so that it appeared to be a new Grand Lodge, and Alton's research said, no, this continuously, it never ceased to exist. And why is this important? What does it mean for us today?
Well, it's based on our judgment that regular, non-clandestine Freemasonry is duly chartered and can trace its chartering back to a worldwide respected Grand Lodge, like the Grand Lodge of the United Grand Lodge of England, or the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland, and basically those three. And if you can't trace your lineage back, you know, you're not considered to be a regular Grand Lodge. And this, you know, I liken this to I'm a dog lover, so you know, if you have an AKC registered dog, okay, it has its pedigree. And if you have a mongrel and it's not AKC registered, then you have a mongrel. And so this is what we're talking about in the context of Freemasonry.
So basically, this interruption, this perceived interruption, which Alton's research has proven wrong, and that is the untold story, this interruption made it so that pedigree cut off, even though the same organization was restarted a few years later. That interruption really, for some people's, for a lot of people's, they consider, well, now you lost that pedigree, that line on continuation to these other parent Grand Lodges, right? And
yes.
So how does this affect Masons today?
Well, I mean, you know, and to get back into that just a little bit more, by the time of the few number of years that rolled by, a whole bunch of new people were in it, and a whole bunch of new Masons had been made Masons. And if they were made Masons by a clandestine lodge, then this was going to be a real problem. Its effect, Alton's research has a far-reaching effect, because if it is true that the Prince Hall National Grand Lodge, the National Compact, never ceased to exist, then we have a whole bunch of brothers that should be declared regular, and it will go a long way to uniting traditional Black Freemasonry in the United States of America.
Right, because today, for people not familiar, who in our audience, with Prince Hall recognition issues, when you say there's a lot of brothers out there, what is this division among recognized and non-recognized Grand Lodges, which each have their origins, or in their very names, back to Prince Hall? What are the organizations involved?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
The PHA, PHO.
Yeah, PHA is Prince Hall affiliated, and PHO is Prince Hall origin. And those two are kind of designated. You got to understand the history that after a while, the National Grand Lodge existed for about 30 years. And after a while, it wasn't liked, and it probably wasn't doing things too well. And maybe it was too political, or maybe it was too demanding. And so states started to break off and form their own, or reform in some cases, or form in other cases, their own state Grand Lodge. And so basically the Grand Lodge, the National Compacts, the National Grand Lodge started to dwindle and lose a lot of membership from among the states in the United States.
And it's a shame we don't have Alton here. Should we wait a few more minutes? We do apologize to our audience. This is a live show again, and sometimes, you know, we've had a streak of shows without any eventualities, but our guest, you know, had a perfectly well working camera and microphone up until now. We have no idea what is going on. We know he's at his lodge and there's technical assistance nearby, so I can just picture the brothers right now trying to get this together. And so Fred, you're very familiar with Alton overall as a scholar, right? And personally, I'm going to show some photographs of you too. Do you want to give us our general thoughts on his work that you have been able to observe over time?
Okay. Let's see what you got up for pictures on the screen.
Okay, here comes the first one.
So that's Alton and myself, and we're at one of the national conventions of the Phylaxis Society, and I'm not sure where this is. I think it might be Arkansas. And we got a break and we're kind of meeting. To say a few words about Alton, he is the ultimate researcher. A lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the records of Prince Hall were kept because Prince Hall didn't have a good library system, were kept in the Iowa Masonic, the Grand Lodge of Iowa Masonic Library. The Grand Lodge, mainstream Freemasonry, but it was keeping Prince Hall records. And so Alton Roundtree, made numerous trips to Iowa and spent days and days and days going through that library and picking out, his research, especially on the National Grand Lodge, because that's where a lot of that information was. So he had to trip out from Washington to there. There is, I don't think, anybody on the scene in Prince Hall that does more research or better research or knows where to get the research than Alton Roundtree.
Wow.
The stuff he's written, I mean, you take a look at it. Let's just take a look for a minute. Bend down here. You see this book, The Conference of Grand Masters, Prince Hall Masons?
That tome.
You see how thick it is? This is, let me quickly look here. This is about 650 pages. Okay.
Can you show the thickness? Okay.
Yeah, sure. And
yes, can you imagine writing that?
Can you imagine writing that? Research.
No.
So then we go to his latest one. Well, one of the latest. It's not the latest, but the one on the history of the Washington D.C. And look at this one.
Yeah, that's the one that he co-authored with Tehuti Evans, who we had here as our interviewee last month. It's a really great interview. Some
pages too. It's beautiful cover. One of the original Grand Lodge buildings on the back. And so you're looking at these really thick books. The only one that wasn't like that I, was the original one Out of the Shadows was not as big and thick like that. But that stuff, I read that the Grand Lodge of Washington D.C. history, and I plowed through that thing, and it was like 2 weeks.
It's true, and you shared.
Long.
And you made notes and shared them with me, and I really appreciated that detailed notes. It's the history of every single Grand Master of the Prince Hall, the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C. And so it details what each one did, about their general background, any notable information that the records show. And it's really fascinating, especially early on, right, Fred? There were some controversies there with like any Grand Lodge forming history or with any large organization, there were some controversies. There were some Grand Masters who were accused of things. It wasn't a smooth ride for its foundation. And that part in particular interested me. But then there's also some notable, Grand Masters there that did a lot. And Frederick's, one of his favorite is the Buffalo Soldier, what's his name?
Mark
Matthews, yes, who lived to 111. And we hope we get our guest back so we can ask him about his interview with him.
Right. Alton Roundtree told me that he had interviewed Mark Matthews at least twice. I know twice. I'm not sure if it's more than that, but and the one thing he regretted is he never tape recorded it. But this Freemason, Prince Hall Freemason, brother Mark Matthews, was an original Buffalo Soldiers. Well, the Buffalo Soldiers were in the 1800s. So,
right.
To get those stories, and a lot of them patrolled Texas, as well as New Mexico and Arizona, and even went to Cuba in that fight and helped Teddy Roosevelt win that battle there.
Well, I'm going to suggest something different. We have never lost a guest on air. So because we're approaching the half-hour mark, I would suggest that we have an interview in two parts. This would be part one, which is mostly an interview of Fred at this point. And we will get off air and check with our guest and see what's going on. And we will be back shortly as soon as we get his camera up and running, which again, we have, this is the second time we have tested it. It was working just fine. We are at a loss. But before we go, at the half-hour mark, I have this other photograph, this recent photograph, Fred. Do you want to tell us about this one?
Right. The Conference of Grand Masters was held just recently, just a few weeks ago in Dallas, Texas. And Alton Roundtree came to set up a booth where he was selling his books and talking to everybody. And so I joined him at his booth, and somebody snapped a picture.
Well, that book there on the desk is the Out of the Shadows book. You said it wasn't thick, and now I see a thick book right there. It's not thin either. It's not as voluminous as the other. Yeah, well, we apologize to our audience again, and we will be back hopefully shortly.
Now,
and we're gonna,
Elena, you don't want to do the artifact now, or do you want to save it?
We could do that. Why don't we stay on air a little longer? Fred, why don't you get on the phone while we show the artifact of the month? Just make sure I'm going to mute you so that we don't hear your conversation. And that is a great idea. We have a really fun artifact of the month for you this time. It is this guy right here, which is a operative setting maul that our founding president found on an auction sale of old tools, and the person selling it didn't know what it was. And it looks like Alton is coming back, Fred, or something changed. But do please call them so that we can get him as soon as possible. And so this is not a Masonic tool, and we thought it was worth showing you. It has all its matches, all its marks from being used, and it is heavy, and it's one of my favorite artifacts. And so we thought it would be fun to show you a video of it, along with Masonic setting maul inspired artifacts. Oh, we have our guest back. But now, Fred, if you can unmute yourself, welcome back, Alton.
Well, thank you. Good to be back.
Yes, you don't have to tell us what happened. We're just happy to have you back. And Fred, as soon as you're unmuted, we are ready to go. And so we had a conversation here while you were gone about your book, The National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry, the Untold Truth. We were explaining to our audience about that work, but yes.
So Alton needs to correct all the misinformation that I put out over the year while he was gone.
Well, what I was going to say is that because you weren't here, we couldn't ask you a very important question. We talked about the history, which is not misinformation. Fred is very knowledgeable about the topic as well. He wasn't misinforming you. But we couldn't ask this question, obviously, because you weren't here. In your opinion, Alton, was the National Grand Lodge a good thing for Prince Hall Freemasonry or not? And what happened to it?
Well, the National Grand Lodge was a good thing for Prince Hall Freemasonry. Prince Hall Freemasonry having started in 1775 or 1778, by 1847, there were only two Prince Hall Grand Lodges, the African Grand Lodge in Boston and the First Independent in Pennsylvania. So it hadn't grown a whole lot. Now, once the National Grand Lodge got started, they started the number of state Grand Lodges started growing and growing and growing. But then all of those were under the National Grand Lodge, and the state Grand Lodges started deciding that maybe they should be sovereign and independent. And they started leaving the National Grand. Some of them started leaving the National Grand Lodge. So by 1878, a lot of them had left, but all of them weren't gone. National Grand Lodge never, at the point in 1878 when it was declared that it had been shut down, which was never true, it had eight state Grand Lodges under it, and it continued to grow thereafter. Actually, I discovered later, I said that in 2006, but I discovered it doing the book on the National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry Untold Truth. I found 3 more Grand Lodges that were still under the National Grand Lodge. So it never had less than 11 state Grand Lodges under it. So it wasn't shut down by a long shot. And also it had under it certainly the most powerful, if you want to talk about the numerical numbers of lodges, King Solomon Grand Lodge of Kansas.
Huh.
So now this shutdown is certainly part of the Prince Hall Freemasonry, that you would find that in the proceedings. You could go to you could go to Missouri proceedings, you could go to Arkansas proceedings for that time period, and you'll see in there they say that it was shut down, but that's not true. But if you're researching and you do a serious cross check of the information, you will find that really they were running a propaganda war, but that went down into the history books. And that was
I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you that if the evidence that it never ceased to exist in the National Compact, then it's there, then I was going to ask, do you think there is a motivation to have the history be different, that it ceased to exist and then restart it? And what would that motivation be, in your opinion?
I can't think of any motivation other than a lot of those Grand Lodges, independent Grand Lodges that left the National Grand Lodge, obviously was once under it. And if the National Grand Lodge was never shut down and didn't cease to exist, then maybe there'll be a question about their legitimacy in that they left the National Grand Lodge.
So PHO is considered clandestine right now by PHA, right?
Not as of 2012. In 2012, at the Prince Hall Conference of Grand Masters, they acknowledged that PHO, or the National Grand Lodge, can trace their lineage back to African Lodge number 459, and that they've had continuity of operation since 1847.
So they accepted your research. I mean, that's something I didn't realize. So they've accepted your research, and they're now considered regular Freemasons, right?
They're not irregular. Yeah, they're
Okay.
regular. They're
Well,
not
these things,
recognized.
right? I mean, Freemasonry, I think our audience and us here know it's slow to develop in matters of recognition of each other's branches in a way. Not that it would necessarily have to develop in that direction, but it's not something that happened instantaneously as if, okay, you know, the evidence is here, now we recognize you in your regular, and it's complicated, is what you're saying, Alton?
Yes. It is complicated because a Grand Lodge could be regular, but not recognized, because each the Grand Lodge is the sovereign. So, you know, one Grand Lodge might recognize them, and another one might not for their own reason. So it becomes complicated in that sense. It's not automatic.
Okay, tell us about the two Grand Lodges that never were.
Well, in the process of doing the research for the book, the National Grand Lodge and Prince Hall Freemasonry, Untold Truth, I was tracing the start of every Prince Hall Grand Lodge in that process, and then I discovered that that Boyer Grand Lodge of New York never existed. When William H. Grimshaw wrote his book about the history of Negro Freemasonry in America in 1903, he created Boyer Grand Lodge and gave it a plausible. So if you go read the book, you're going to see the star, the officers that was there. I mean, everything is there, but it never existed.
Wow.
You won't find, and I'm saying this is, you won't find anything with the word Boyer Grand Lodge on it before 1903. Then after 1903, by about 1910, then the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in New York and other Grand Lodge and historians followed Grimshaw, and Boyer Grand Lodge became a part of the history of Prince Hall Freemason, but Boyer Grand Lodge never existed. Now, there was another Grand Lodge that didn't exist in 1845 either. Grimshaw had said that the first colored Grand Lodge of Maryland was supposed to have been started in 1845, but actually it was 1847. I mean 1848, before that Grand Lodge was established. Now, if I was gonna Grimshaw told so many stories that, you know, you don't really want to speculate on Grimshaw, but if I was going to speculate, I would say that he probably created those two Grand Lodges, so he would be able to say that in 1847 all Prince Hall Grand Lodges did not come under the National Grand Lodge, because if all of them came under the National Grand Lodge, it would be just like I said in that book. You could know every Prince Hall Grand Lodge, if it traces its lineage back to African Lodge 459 and the Grand Lodge of England, they must go through they can't do it without going through the National Grand Lodge.
Yeah, so I think the other point to be made is that before the National Grand Lodge, there were just two Prince Hall Grand Lodges in the whole United States, and it's been that way for a while. And once the National Grand Lodge came on the scene, wow, did Grand Lodges spread all across the nation. Say a few words about that.
Well, yeah, they spread all over the nation. The Richard Howard Gleaves and the National Grand Lodge, they started forming lodges. They started venturing out. They started going west. They went into Missouri, and then on over into Kansas and Indiana, Illinois. They went all over. And then after
Texas.
Then Texas. And then after the Civil War, they went south.
Well, speaking of African Lodge 459, in the new Philaxis Society book, Lux et Tenebris, in their new publication, you published an article titled Greatest Prince Hall Mason of the 19th Century, John T. Hilton. And this is a really nice compilation of, by the Philaxis Society. We recommend that our last month's guest, Tehuti Evans, who we secretly have nearby to bring up to have him join us in a few minutes, also has an article there about Hermeticism. in Freemasonry. And so tell us about this greatest Prince Hall Mason of the 19th century, John T. Hilton. Who was he?
John T. Hilton, greatest Prince Hall Mason in the 19th century. John T. Hilton, I guess he came out of Pennsylvania and came to Boston about 1823 or 1824. He immediately joined the anti-slavery movement, and he entered into Freemasonry there, and immediately, went on to become a Grand Master, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence for African Lodge 459 in 1827. But John T. Hilton was the individual who lived Masonry. That was his life. He had Masonry, he had the church, and he had he was an abolitionist, and those were the things he did, and that was the life he lived, and on a daily basis.
We read the article, and we found it to be fascinating and well worth finding viewers. And he was actually very active in the Boston area and one of the most influential free Black men of his time. Was it common for early Prince Hall Masons, well-known early Prince Hall Masons, to also be political activists at the time?
Well, they were activists because they were freed, and Masons like John T. Hilton and Thomas Dalton, they had the ability and the knowledge, and they were doing everything they could to uplift Black people. But I don't know if I'd call them political, because they didn't bring that to the lodge necessarily. But but in their daily activities, I don't know how you separate them, but that was what they did.
Right. Aside, not in Freemasonry, they weren't politicizing Freemasonry. They were just known and active as political actors outside of Freemasonry. What was the Liberator, and how is Hilton involved in its history?
The Liberator was William Lloyd Garrison's, I guess, paper that was published weekly from 1831 to 1864, and its emphasis, of course, was abolition. And William Lloyd Garrison was probably the foremost in that. Now, Hilton, starting in probably about the end of 1831, he wrote articles in the Liberator. He supported the Liberator. He supported William Lloyd Garrison. So really, Hilton had a I guess you could say, a stage, an outlet for everything he was doing. It gave him a national outlet, and there was a very few issues of the Liberator between 1831 and 1864 that John T. Hilton doesn't have something in there.
Well, you mentioned, yes, right.
Well, I just wanted to ask Brother Roundtree, you were the founding worshipful master of the David A. McWilliams Senior Research and Education Lodge. Tell us a little bit about the circumstances of the founding of that.
Well, the founding of it is that there was a group of us here that felt that we needed something, that we needed a research and education lodge. Because in Prince Hall Freemasonry, a functioning research and education lodge was probably non-existent. We hadn't had one since 1943 that had actually published transactions until we published our transactions in, I think it was 2011. So we had a core of brothers. The Grand Master agreed that if we could put things together, he would certainly go along with it. Now, he didn't ask us to use his name, but we used it, David A. McWilliams Sr. So, but I'm gonna tell you, it's a lot of work putting something like that together. We checked what everyone else was doing. I think the Research and Education Lodge of Missouri and Southern California was good examples to follow. So we kind of patterned ourselves after that to a degree.
Excellent. Well, before we leave the topic of the greatest Prince Hall Mason of the 19th century, there's just one last question I would really like to ask. I think it's worth, for our viewers who are not that familiar with Prince Hall history, if you could please explain this. You mentioned early on when we reached this topic that Hilton wrote the Declaration of Independence for African Lodge 459. This made the lodge break away from who?
From the Grand Lodge of England. The only thing
from the Unite
well,
yes?
when they wrote it, they were writing it for breaking away from the Grand Lodge of England. See, in 1813,
right.
the two Grand Lodges in Europe, the Grand Lodge of England and we call them the Ancients and the Moderns, but anyway, they are merged in 1813, and in 1813, before they merged, all of them cleaned their rosters, cleared their rosters. Basically, they dropped, as indicated we list them all in the Out of the Shadows, is they cleared their rosters basically of all of the lodges in North America, including African Lodge 459.
Including mainstream.
And including mainstream, yes. Yes.
Right.
Cleared all of them off the roster. And so in 1827, when he did the Declaration of Independence, they didn't know they had been dropped. They probably didn't know they had been dropped from the rolls. They were never under the United Grand Lodge of England that was formed in 1813.
But truly, in the spirit of the times, they wrote, the spirit of the times, meaning, the African American struggle in this country. They wrote a Declaration of Independence, and it had a strong, and it still has a strong sentimental value. That way, even though technically, as you say, they weren't really breaking away from the United Grand Lodge of England. Fred?
Well, before we go on to the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of DC history, Lane, I think because there was a separation here, we ought to give Brother Roundtree his due time. So
Absolutely.
We may extend this broadcast a little longer than it usually is, but
absolutely.
He also wrote a big book on the Conference of Grand Masters, Prince Hall Masons, and do you have any behind-the-scenes interesting stories or anecdotes about Grand Masters who led this conference that generally we don't know about?
Well, one that certainly always stands out with me is that in 1950, when Amos T. Hall, who was the president of the Conference of Grand Masters from 1950 to probably around to the mid 1960s and going on into the 1970s, he brought Thurgood Marshall to the conference in 1950, and pretty much just told him that, hey, if he came to the conference, they might be able to help him. Thurgood Marshall was, of course, working a lot of civil rights cases, and he was working up to the 1954 case, but he had a major problem was he couldn't compete with the white lawyers in these different cases because he didn't have the funds for the researchers. He needed researchers to go out and do research, and so he came there in the conference. He came to the Conference of Grand Masters, and they said they would support that, and they did. Didn't take long because Amos T. Hall said he thought it'd be a good thing to do. John G. Lewis Jr. said, "What are we waiting for?" And they started off. Now I got to give just due to the Shriners and to the United Supreme Council because they joined in, and between them, the Prince Hall Freemasonry dug deep and gave him what he needed, and for years thereafter, Thurgood Marshall said he could not have won the 1954 civil rights decision without Prince Hall Freemasonry. Could not.
Wow. And, one of the Grand Masters I wish that I had met, because he passed just before I became active in Prince Hall. And I'd like you to say a few words about is Grandmaster Howard Woods of Arkansas. He was considered quite the man.
Well, yeah, Howard Woods was quite the man. I don't know if anybody told better jokes, but no, he was a very sincere Mason Prince Hall Mason who traveled far, and actually in the in the 70s and 80s, probably him and Joe Walks was the only Prince Hall Mason that was really dealing with white masonry on a regular basis. He was often called to speak at different venues, and he spread the word of Prince Hall Freemasonry during that time. Now, he was also, for a period of time, he was the president. Well, he was the president of the Prince Hall Conference of Grand Masters, where he did a good job there. He always was promoting Prince Hall Freemasonry, always promoting the individual. He was a type of individual. If you had a conversation with him, you might see him 6 months later. He probably would say, "Well, Fred, if you told him something, how's that going?" You know, he was that way. He had a tremendous memory of things.
So, nothing like a leader who. Go on.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was going to say nothing like a leader who really, is personable with the people, that they come into contact with. Fred?
So maybe now we should go, if you think so, Elena, into the history of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of DC, and maybe welcome Tehuti Evans, the co-author.
Yes, we are very lucky here to have Tehuti Evans and Alton Roundtree, co-authors of the book on the history of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, the District of Columbia. Well, thank you.
I call them the dynamic duo.
Well, they're a pleasure to work with. We're very lucky to have you both here. Welcome, Tehuti. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Alton. Right, if you can unplug the headphones so Tehuti can hear us. Do you want to just unplug the headphones so you can both hear us? You don't have to take turns. Can you hear me now, Tehuti?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can definitely hear you.
Okay.
But with echo, I think we need those headphones. Unfortunately, there's no way to split them.
Let me speak a minute, because I think they went away.
Yeah, no, they're there. Why don't we take turns asking them? Well, Fred, do you want to ask them something, or do I take it away?
The logical question is, how did this book come about? Why was it created?
Well, it was created. It was a project for the David A. Williams Senior Research and Education Lodge. After we formed the Research and Education Lodge, we had been talking about doing the history of DC, but we thought a project for the Research and Education Lodge, so we started working on it. Brother Tehuti he wasn't even a Mason then, but he came and he was working. I guess he's working full time, helping around the library and everything, and so we started working on it. But a few months later, though, he was late at night.
Yes, he joined during the process of this book then. And so how did you go about gathering the records, the history? Tell us about the research process.
Well, getting the records here, just probably like a lot of Prince Hall Grand Lodge, all of the proceedings were not here. And I don't know, I think I made, 1, 2, 3, probably about 4 trips to Iowa to collect all the information that was needed. And for the years that we didn't have any proceedings, then we had to look in the proceedings of other Grand Lodges to see what did they say about DC, at a different time, because the CCFC chairman of the Committee of Foreign Correspondence, they used to review all the proceedings from all the Grand Lodges, and they would comment on it in their Grand Lodge proceedings. So we chased that, and any place that we could find something, that we put together a pretty good, some of the pretty good documentation trail for the Grand Lodge.
Oh, absolutely. How long did this process take to write the whole book from start to finish?
What would it be, about 6 years?
Wow. Wow. And what was it like to collaborate with each other? I understand you've become great friends since then, and what a great story for joining Freemasonry, Tehuti, and also for starting a what appears to be a lifelong friendship at this point. How is it for you guys to work together? Is this the only work that you have worked as co-authors together or co-researchers?
Well, it was the one of the great experiences of my life, working.
Wow.
Again, my background is as a historian. I have a background in history. In African American history, I specifically specialized in. And in fact, that's why I was called in to assist in the project. But great characters that I knew that are otherwise talked about in African American studies, the fact that they were Masons aren't mentioned in those discussions. So finding these men were Masons, you know, like in the proceedings of the Grand Lodge here, the lodges, and
Amazing.
It was just an amazing thing for me to find out what John F. Cook was. What I knew of John F. Cook as a great Black Washingtonian, but I didn't know he was Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge here. See,
wow.
So I learned quite a bit. I also learned in the process the important role that Freemasonry played in establishing African American communities. I mean, people just don't live together and become a community. You need to have institutions in those communities. And what I found is that the two major institutions which made an African American community was the Black Church and the Black Lodge.
Wow.
Those two pillars of the Black community. So in other words, without an organized body of Black men working in the interest of people living together, that was the key that I didn't know anything about. You know, like
wow.
During the period of, you know, discrimination, segregation, what have you, how these people were able to move forward, you know, in our democracy. I just didn't understand what the key was until I started this project with Brother Roundtree and subsequently learned, you know, like the Masonic input. And again, Masonry gave the Black men the stability, the organizing, the tenets of organizing, the tenets of running a community meeting, not just in the lodge, but then as they are meeting outside of the lodge as a community. All of these things that, you know, coming from the trail of captivity and then into freedom, these brothers needed a way of they needed a way of learning how to work together to make progress. And again, the Masonic Masonry gave them a way of doing that. As Masons, they worked together in the lodge, then meeting in the community as a citizens group. They knew how to organize. They knew some aspects of Robert's Rules of Order. They knew how to conduct themselves and get things done. That's one of what I call the great secrets that American history doesn't address. You know, how did people come from that period of, you know, like being quote unquote slaves, getting free, and then being able to organize themselves into communities that still exist to today.
Yeah, well, which
here in the nation's capital. I mean, the story in Washington, D.C., I think is unique among the 50 states in terms of the progress made by free Blacks between 1822 and 2016. It's a very unique story here that doesn't apply across the rest of the country. So it was, again, one of the best experiences of my life was meeting Brother Roundtree, getting a chance to work with him these past 6 years. But I just want to add one other thing. Also working with him with the Masonic Digest. He was not just writing with the book, but I became one of the contributors to helping, you know, with the newspaper. And in addition, when he, the 2 years he stepped down, I substituted as the editor of the newspaper. And so yeah, so our friendship is deep, it's long, and it will be a lifelong friendship.
So let me ask you this: the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia was begun, it was formed when the U.S. was still half slave driven. How hard was it in those early years?
Well, it was very difficult. In fact, the Social Lodge was Social Lodge. The first lodge formed here in Washington, D.C. in 1825. That was difficult. Having a lodge of black men meeting in the South was against the law for all practical purposes. So the meetings were really held in secret in order to avoid the police. But at the same time, tell you, Brother Roundtree wrote an article in the Masonic Digest. It must be about 5 or 6 years ago. It's called One Face Public, One Face Private, in which he pointed out that there were a lot of white Masons who publicly towed the line of white Masonry in reference to blacks in Masonry. But privately, they worked hand in hand with black Masons and helped establish or helped us establish the running of our meetings in due form, the keeping of our minutes and proceedings in due form. All of those things were brought to us by good-hearted white Masons who publicly were chastising us for being in the craft, but privately they helped us. The man who became Grand Master of Masons in the District of Columbia allowed the men of Social Lodge number 1 to meet in his barn. That was their lodge meeting. He provided a place for them to meet, breaking the law. Allowed us to meet. So there was, I would say during our whole sojourn on here, there have always been some whites who worked hand in hand for us both to move forward. There were white abolitionists who wanted to end the institution of slavery. So our progress and where we are on our journey in 2017 didn't occur just by our own hands, working hand in hand with good-hearted people like our tenets tell us Masons are, is how we got to this place.
So the popular Masonic saying, that Masonry is not a secret society, but a society with secrets. In this case, at that time, this was really a secret, as you were saying, illegal meetings that were taking place. So this was actually a real secret underground.
Up until 1847. Now, you were talking about the National Lodge, National Grand Lodge movement for a minute. What was left out was the fact that white Masons in America were discussing the possibility of forming a National Grand Lodge.
Baltimore Convention.
I would say that we got the idea from hearing white Masons talking about he jumped the gun and ran forward with it and formed a National Grand Lodge.
Right.
I don't know exactly when the idea of forming a National Grand Lodge really died out in mainstream Masonry. But the idea was not just a black thing. The fact that each country having a National Grand Lodge was the standard in Masonry. What's different with the United States is the United States, in forming the 13 states, considered themselves states as countries, and as a united band of countries being the United States. Therefore, in the long run, after discussions, each of these individual states decided to have their own Grand Lodge as a state, as if a country.
And this is very useful information. Our show is watched all over the world. We see that on our statistics all the time. And this is the meeting of Masonry and U.S. history, as you were mentioning, the creation of the colonies and how this country was founded as individual entities under a general federation concept, but they really maintain their individuality. So unlike the United Grand Lodge of England and other countries, in the United States, politically, aside from Masonry, the state governments have have traditionally, historically, and to this day maintained a sense of individuality in their laws and in their entity. And this has translated into U.S. Masonry, where we have the state Grand Lodges, and we were talking about the attempts by now, as you call it, the white Masons, or the mainstream Masons, as we call them here on the show, to create a national Grand Lodge, and how this was actually put into practice. And we talked about its history in the Prince Hall context. And it's fascinating because it's something uniquely American. Would you agree, to both our guests?
I agree, but I'll give you another instance of that. With the formation of the Conference of Grand Masters. If you believe it or not, on the wall of the Masonic Library in Iowa, there is a typewritten document as to when mainstream Masonry started their approach toward a Conference of Grand Masters. Well, the Prince Hall Masonry approached it and established it first. Eventually, mainstream Masonry created a similar institution where where all the state Grand Masters meet as a conference. But again, an idea that was discussed, and here again, something that African American Masonry took off with and established far earlier than what happened in Masonry.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. Thank you for that. I bet a lot of our audience didn't know that either.
Fred, in that book you have there, Roundtree's book on the Council of Grand Masters.
Right.
Yeah, right there early in that book, it's a picture. There is a picture on page 3 in the introduction, where the statement is. The 1918 Cedar Rapids Conference of Grand Masters was called by Iowa's Grand Master George L. Schoonover.
Oh.
Masonic Grand Lodges could aid the victims of World War I. But again, the 1980 conference was the forerunner of the Conference of Grand Masters, which has met annually since 1926. Well, the Prince Hall Conference of Grand Masters was established in 1915. See, so 3 years before the 1918 conference, and definitely before the 1926 conference. So that's again an instance where we're talking about in our mechanisms. But again, the Prince Hall Conference of Grand Masters is the Prince Hall Masons established this Conference of Grand Masters to aid in its development. Again, a little bit ahead of quote unquote mainstream Masonry.
Well, you were talking about how you discovered these great men that you had no idea were also Masons.
Right.
What is the most surprising, or is there something that most surprised you, most intrigued you about the history of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in the District of Columbia?
The thing that was most surprising is that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia was its membership was the basis for the elite Black residents of the District of Columbia. Who's who of Black Washington were Masons. It was a very interesting circle. There have been other books that have been written about the uniqueness of this upper middle class Black community that lived here in the District of Columbia. There were two things. Because of the federal government, some of these men had jobs like at the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, and these other government agencies, which earned them salaries and a level of respect. But the fact that they were Masons, if you were a Black man in Washington, D.C., and you were somebody you wanted to be in the inside club, you had to be a Mason.
Interesting.
So
very interesting.
Let me ask.
Community is talked about in general Washington D.C. history. It's more often than not, it's never mentioned that these men were Masons.
So let me ask Brother Roundtree a question that I asked you, Tehuti, when you were interviewed on our last. Which Grand Master do you think had the greatest impact?
I would say
on the Grand Lodge.
had the greatest impact.
Who
Now,
was it?
John F. Cook. And
Hmm.
John F. Cook came in as Grand Master. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lodges. We had 5 lodges. When John F. Cook left, we had 11 lodges.
Wow.
He more than doubled the number of lodges, but also he came in right after the Civil War period there, and he was an organizer. He got many things done. He was also he was one of the elite. Absolutely, he was a tax collector. He was the register for the city. He was the tax collector for the city. He was a representative at a couple of the national conferences. He was a representative at the conference that elected Ulysses S. Grant. He was
Republican National Convention.
he had a Republican National Convention.
Well, when we lost you too, we talked a little bit about Brother Mark Matthews, Buffalo Soldier, who lived until the age of 111. And I know Fred wants to ask something about it. So, Fred?
Well, having written something on the Buffalo Soldiers, this was an extraordinary story. And I understand that you interviewed him, I think, twice. So to interview the man in person must have been something. Tell us a little bit about what he told you.
Well, it was quite an experience to interview Mark Matthews. The first time I interviewed him, I think he was 104.
Wow.
So I stopped by to interview him, and he came down with his cup of coffee and sat down to talk with me. He was an oral historian. I mean, he had, how the stories had gone. He could talk about the history of his family back 300 years.
My goodness.
Wow.
And his father had lived to, I think, 115, he says. And his grandfather was supposed to have lived to about 119. So he could talk back. And whenever he was talking, it seemed like he always talked in the language of the day, whatever it was at that period of time. But he was born in 1894. He went in the military, and when he was 15, about 16, he told a story on the page, and he was in at 16. And he spent most of his time in the South, early in the Southwest. And he told me stories about, what it was like there. That the most important thing you could have would be your sidearm and your horse, because to get you out of trouble and whatever. So they fought the Indians, and he was with the unit that captured Pancho Villa. But he wasn't on the spot when it happened. But he was with the unit that went.
Oh, really?
To Pancho Villa.
I mean, the other question that comes to mind, and that's very interesting, but to change the subject a little bit, tell us about the times at the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of D.C. when bogus masonry came upon the scene, and how difficult a time that was.
Well, it was a difficult time. That was in the mid-1890s, about the time that John G. Jones were establishing a lot of irregular and bogus organizations, and about the time being removed from a few organizations that came to DC. And the problem was that a lot of the members of DC, of the the Grand Lodge here in DC and the lodges, some of them went into these organizations, especially like Dorsey, Seville, and others, and they had the Grand Master issued a mandate that those that had done that must cease immediately or be expelled. So most of them came back, but Dorsey, Seville, and a few others, they never came back. And from that date on, I think today there's probably 11 or 12 irregular Grand Lodges in the District of Columbia.
Wow. Well, that's very interesting. I can't leave you two sitting together without. And we've already asked this question, so I want to ask it again. All right, because I think it's so important and so interesting a subject. That's about the recognition process, and you can talk about it with DC because you were intimately involved with this, Brother Roundtree. Just a little bit more insight. Who approached who, and what were the characters involved that talked to each other, and how quickly did it go? And I could ask 10 or 15 questions about it, but I think
Well,
people would like to know a little bit more in depth.
well, I was fortunate to be working with Paul Best at that time, and Paul was on top of the recognition issues. He had contacts in all of the different Grand Lodges. They consulted with him. Now, Paul had one of the best websites
Yeah.
it was in Freemasonry. But so they were consulting with Paul, and he would give them information. And they really had a major problem in that mainstream Freemasonry really didn't know much about Prince Hall Freemasonry. So they were getting ready to enter into an arena which they didn't know the history of. They had no reason to. If they were clandestine, there was no reason for them to spend time trying to check on that history. So, but Paul, everybody was consulting Paul from all over. But one thing we found is that there was always behind the scenes of work. Many times the Grand Lodges have worked together. They've been contacting, working together for years. So, and then when two grandmasters came that really wanted to happen, then they usually could move forward, and it would happen. Now, in Out of the Shadows, we tracked from 1989 Connecticut up to the time of the book in 2006. We detail how each one of those how recognition was arrived at in each state. Where they had recognition at. The characters, and one of the big things had to do. Most of the mainstream Grand Lodges had to make constitutional changes and make code changes, whereby they no longer, they couldn't recognize a bogus or the regular clandestine Prince Hall Grand Lodge, so they had to take those things out of their codes. But it was the first private behind the scenes of work that got these things done, and seemed like most of them used it, and there was always agreements on how this was gonna happen. It seemed like
I bet
most of them used as a template the Colorado agreement. Some version of the Colorado agreement seemed like that kind of covered most issues. So most people worked off of that.
in the book there are mentioned visitations from Liberia and Bermuda. Are these still taking place? How often did these special visitations occur? Are they still occurring?
Well, they still occur and can occur, but there's no set time on them. It probably depends on who the Grandmaster is and what kind of foreign contacts that we have at a given point in time.
Excellent. Well, I think this is a good time. Fred?
Something that's really important before we move on. I think discuss the effect of Watts attending the International Masonic Congress in 1902.
Well, with Watts attending Congress and there being Grand Lodges there from all over the world, he made the contacts that a few years later, I think DC had recognition with, I don't remember exact number, but there was many Grand Lodges around the world we had contact with. Now, I had to be, some of that might have been, there was some confusion about whether Watts was from the mainstream Grand Lodge or from the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, but we had those contacts. But as time went on, they began to drop off. One case in point that I remember was Chile. Chile came back about 3 years later and said they were going to have to drop recognition because they've been informed by the mainstream Grand Lodge of DC that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge was irregular or clandestine.
Really? Really? Wow.
Yeah, that was kind of
Wow.
responsible on that. And then that's in the book, Fred.
Yep. I know, I read it. I read it.
Well, we went over 20 minutes past our usual time because we lost you for 20 minutes. But I think this is a good time to show our Artifact of the Month video. Alton Roundtree, if you please do us a favor of sticking with us during it. I think you'll enjoy it. I already explained what it is about, and now it's about 7 minutes long, and we'll come back at the other end of the video.
Good.
And we'll be able to hear you, Alton, during the video.
All right.
Phoenix Masonry Live's Masonic Artifact Series.
I am Frederick L. Milliken, Executive Director of Phoenix Masonry.
And I am Elena Llamas, Director of Public Relations for Phoenix Masonry. And today we're going to show you this fantastic artifact, which is a real used operative masonry setting maul, which is chipping away on my computer as I speak. I may be a bit too delicate wearing gloves for this one, but we didn't want to break with the tradition here of handling artifacts with gloves for you. You can see all the scratches that it has from being used.
The setting maul in operative masonry is used for setting stones. That is, tapping them to a firm seat in the mortar by urging them sideways into place. In speculative masonry, it is considered to be a symbol of untimely death. In some lodges, it is improperly used by the master as his gavel, from which it totally differs in form and symbolic signification. The gavel is a symbol of order and decorum. The setting maul of death by violence. Here at Phoenix Masonry, we have a number of artifacts where Masons use the symbol of the setting maul in artifacts of different usage. One of these is the snuff box. Snuff was once the most popular form of tobacco addiction and the social vice of vogue. The snuff box was not only a practical necessity, but also an important symbol of social standing, identity, and personal regard. Available in any and all materials and shapes, boxes range from the fine to plain in all mediums. The Scottish snuff container is a perfect example of something any affluent Mason would desire to own. Functional in its ability to safely store snuff and unique in its shape and design, this miniature setting maul would have been the perfect accessory and status symbol. It measures 2 inches tall by 1 3/4 inches in diameter and looks like it was turned out of a solid piece of mahogany. Gift of Kilwinning Lodge, Edinburgh, 1908.
We also have on Phoenix Masonry a Masonic setting maul fob. A fob is an ornament attached to a fob chain, most often used with a pocket watch. This artifact measures 1 inch tall, 9/16 inch diameter, and when open, it measures 1 3/4 inches between the star points. The base is beautifully hand engraved with the 3-letter cipher of its original owner. Also on Phoenix Masonry, we have an early Masonic setting maul whiskey flask, which is a rare yellow ware Masonic whiskey flask, setting maul shaped, decorated with various Masonic working tools and symbolism.
There are other artifacts where on Phoenix Masonry where the setting maul was used. A dated setting maul flask, approximately 9.5 inches tall. Inscribed, Mary Gallacher, 1843. Molded, incised, etc., by hand, and has many different techniques in the execution of this finely made piece. Also incised by hand, with the date and maker on the bottom of the piece at the time it was made. Next, we have a stoneware setting maul. Two-tone finish, believed to be Pennsylvania in origin. 11 inches tall, in mint condition. One piece, incised, John and Mary Turner, 1860. Most of these pieces were European in manufacture. Very unusual to find one of American origin. Lastly, we have a nice, rare Masonic Lodge stoneware decanter that stands 10 inches high and 7.5 inches at the base. The name on the decanter reads James Stephen, the Carrier's Bottle Inch. It is rare to find an example like this where the emblems have been laid on in a slab method before glazing. It must date 1860 when this process was used. Inch is a place in Aberdeenshire, and that is the Masonic setting maul decanter. We want to make a special thanks to Brother Al Lohman, a 30-year collector and a 30-year plus Masonic Lodge member from Wisconsin.
Linked here below, you will find more photographs of this particular setting maul, and also links to the other artifacts we described here. And thank you for joining us on this, our 6th installment of Phoenix Masonry Live's Masonic Artifact Series. Until next time.
Aloha.
Well, thank you. Our guests are muted now. They can unmute themselves. Thank you for staying with us during that Artifact of the Month. We sure hope you enjoyed it. And we are very grateful for your visit to our show. We had a great time. We learned a lot of Prince Hall history. For our audience who may know a lot about Prince Hall, I'm sure this was a great show to watch. For those who don't know a lot about it, you can see how rich and how abundant and how complex the history is in this country of Prince Hall Freemasonry. So we definitely recommend that you read Alton Roundtree's books and his joint books with Tehuti Evans. And of course, also Tehuti Evans's work was discussed when he visited our show last month. Definitely worth reading about. Prince Hall is a very strong Masonic institution here, and well worth your time. So thank you again. It was a pleasure. We had a great time. We learned a lot, and we appreciate your patience with us, audience. This is a live show. We had some technical difficulties, which we hadn't had in a long time. So please forgive us this time. And thank you again. And Fred is writing something on a piece of paper. Unmute yourself. I think they are muted themselves. Can you talk? Oh,
You can't press?
yeah, now we can hear you.
Now we
Well,
can hear you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's time to say goodbye, and that's all we have for you this time.
Well, thank you very much
Thank
again
you.
for inviting us to be your guest, and we'll see you next time.
Yes, hopefully. So, and that's all for this time. I'm Elena Llamas.
I'm Frederick L. Milliken, parting on the square.
Pots.